We're now going to learn how to raise errors on bad input into a function. This is a very common place to raise an error within the body of a function. So you have some function that requires a variable to be of a certain type and maybe even of a certain value. You can check that the type is correct and check that the value is correct. And if they're incorrect, then you raise an error and say, hey, user, you are doing something wrong. So we want to just verify that this input into this function is correct. If it's not correct, then it cannot complete its task. All right, so this function over here, sum n, is going to return the sum of the first n positive integers. So say it's 10. If n is 10, then it'll sum up the numbers from 1 to 10. So one way to do this is with the sum function, and you pass it a range object from 1 to n plus 1. Remember, n is not included as the endpoint, so we need to add 1 to this over here, and that will do it. We don't even have to start at 1. You can start at 0 because summing 0 doesn't do anything. But this does need to be n plus 1, so the last number is n. So here, this creates that range from 1 to, if it's 10, it's 1 to 10, or sequence of 1 to 10. Then we just sum it up. Okay, so if we use this, say sum of 10, that's 55. Let's do a different one that's a little bit easier. Sum of 4 is 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. That is 10. Now, if we try to do, if we try to put in a string over here, where it will produce an error. But what I want to do is, so this error that's produced, it's not going to be that useful to the user if they do this. I know what this means. It happens right here. It tries to do n plus 1, and it's getting an error. But let's try to make let's create our own errors if the user does something wrong. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the is instance. Number one is n, this argument must be a positive integer. So number one, it has to be an integer. So we're going to say if not is instance. So if it's not an integer, so we just learned how to do this. So if it's not an integer, then we will, so we're going to go into this code block if it's true. We're going to raise and we get to choose what we want to do. We're going to raise a type error, and we can say that n must be an integer. So we're telling the user they have to supply n as an integer. And what you can do over here, we can make an f string not a type of n. So whatever, you can actually give them a very specific message. This is pretty cool over here. We can use an f string, which allows us to substitute in some Python code. So we're going to say so this only gets raised if n is not an integer. So we'll just say, we'll tell the user, all right, you passed in this over here. So we're just using an f string like that. So now I'm going to re-enter in this function. I'm going to go, let's just do it up here now. And if we pass in this, so now we get our specific message. So it says n must be an integer, not a string. That's pretty cool. So we gave it a very specific one. If we give it a number like this, 5.5, n must be an integer, not a float, right? So if we pass in a list, here's an empty list. No, it cannot be a list, and so forth. All right, now the next piece is, so if it passes this, so if it is an integer, it will go on, but it has to be a positive integer. So this actually, it does return something over here, but that's not really a correct result. That's not what the function says. It says it returns sum the first n positive integers. So what we can do here, now we are assured that n is an integer, so we know this part of the question will work. So if n is less than or equal to 0, that means the user has inputted in something bad. So we want to raise another error here. We can say raise a value error. It's no longer a wrong type, it's the wrong value. And we'll say, again, we'll use an f string. N must be a positive integer, not, and this time we'll just put in the actual value of n, not the type. So let's go ahead and do this. We don't want it to return anything because this is bad input. So now if we do -10, we're going to say n must be a positive integer, not -10. So it has two checks now. Here's sum of 5. So if it passes both checks, if it's both an integer and it is greater than 0, then it will run successfully and actually just complete its task. So this is pretty cool. You just have these couple of checks over here. This is actually somewhat common. In Python, you can pass in any types of objects to a function. So it's common to check for the type using isInstance. And if it's a bad type, then we can just raise this type error and say, hey, user, you've given the wrong type. And in this case, we're going to say, hey, user, this is the wrong value. It is the right type. It is an integer, but it is the wrong value. Okay, so that is just a common way of handling and checking for types and values.